Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another exciting episode of Caught on the Mic. I got to tell you, this is really a welcome change of pace for me. I cannot say how many episodes I've had to have like Cliff's notes of my guests in front of me. And it's like, I know my guests, but I've had to have Cliff's notes in front of me just so I didn't fuck anything up. But I'm very lucky to welcome a friend, a longtime Omaha, Nebraska music veteran. It's awesome to kind of take things back to the homestead. Dan Cinotto, he is a former member of the band Downshift, current member of the band Narcotic Self, and he hosts a fantastic podcast called We Were Loud Once, talking about a time that I hold near and dear to my heart, and I bet he didn't even know it. Dan, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thank you. How are you?
Oh, I'm fantastic. How about that introduction?
Yeah, I'm speechless. That was very nice. That was very, very kind of you. But yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Awesome, man. Well, I want to just rip the Band-Aid off and get right into it. You guys are 8 episodes into We Were Loud Once. Why don't you take a moment, introduce yourself, and kind of talk about the concept behind the show?
Yeah, so it was interesting. So a couple months back, my counterpart on the show, Jeff Geaghan, he reached out to me and he and I had played together in the band Downshift. Oh geez, 20 plus years ago now. And he was like, would you be interested in possibly doing a podcast with me? And because he had, after Downshift had kind of ran its course, he got into kind of voiceover work and podcasting and things like that. And that's when I had joined another band. And so he reached out and I said, what about? What are you thinking? And he's like, well, how about new metal? And I was like, okay, I feel like I may have some stories and some things to say about it. So sure, let's do it. And it's been very exciting. It's been very natural, and we were very lucky to kind of have been brought up in a music scene that was very especially for that genre of music, I suppose, it was very opportunistic, if that's the right word. We were, you know, actually this let me back up a minute. The podcast itself is giving me an opportunity to kind of relive some of those things
Yeah.
that I hadn't thought about in years, and so kind of thinking about those things and telling those stories, it's like, I'm kind of putting that stuff back out there, and I'm able to kind of be grateful for it because, in talking with young bands, today, they don't have opportunities like we had,
Right.
to open up for, people that, we were massive fans of and be able to play alongside them. And, that's very rare these days.
I kind of share a similar trajectory, and I have to be careful being that I'm a guest driven podcast. It has opened up a lot of my memory banks where I'm able to have a music guest on my show and share a lot of common experiences, but I have to be careful and be like, okay, I can't make this about myself. I have to
Right. Yeah.
express some level of objectivity whenever talking about it. But I'm glad you brought up the opportunities we had back in that era of like 25 years ago. Um, People do not understand enough what was going on in the Midwest, Omaha and Des Moines in the
Oh,
late 90s and early 2000s. 2001, 2002, the Saddle Creek scene blew up, and I kind of
yeah.
feel like the mainstream music industry missed out on a lot of what was going on here at that point in time.
Absolutely. And it was, and in fact, Jeff and I just released an episode this week where we were kind of talking about kind of coming up in the shadow of what was happening in the Midwest. And at that time it was Slipknot, and kind of the things that were, I suppose, expected of us in terms of a performance and in terms of a look and all of these things. And so it's definitely interesting to relive it. But yeah, there was a lot going on here outside of that during that time period. And there was, I don't remember where I heard it or where I read it. But labels were talking about us potentially being the next Seattle, you
Yes.
know.
Yeah.
Um, And am I remembering that right? I feel like
No,
I am.
you're absolutely right. It was the Wall Street Journal, an article where they were writing about, I think, Bright Eyes, Cursive, and the Faint
Sure.
blowing up
Yeah.
right around 2001, where they cited Omaha as being the next Seattle, which is just crazy to think about in
Wow.
hindsight.
I didn't know it was in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah,
I thought that was just kind of something that was maybe casually said, That's wild.
that's why everybody on Slam Omaha, for those that don't know what Slam Omaha was, you're probably better off,
Well,
cited the article
yeah.
so much.
Yeah, I Slam Omaha, that's a whole different thing. And Jeff actually he made a comment on the show about it stood for support local art and music, and it turned into just taking the word slam literally,
Yes.
and and going on there, and it was kind of an airing of grievances towards the end of its lifespan. But yeah, it was wild to be around during that time. And like I said, it's kind of allowed Jeff and I to kind of remember some of those experiences. There were stories that I long forgot about.
Yeah.
And So it's fun to kind of relive those.
Well, let's drill down into it a little bit. I remember, and I've cited this on my show several times. I lived at the perfect midpoint between Des Moines and Omaha when the whole Slipknot thing was happening. When they were a local band, like I've known Sophia John since I was
Mhm.
16 years old. I will not say how old I am now, but she was program director of a radio station in Des Moines in the mid 90s, and I was the little punk rock kid that used to go to the Slipknot shows, like when they had their first lineup, and then the lineup that actually got their major label deal. One of my shows before I moved to Omaha in 1998 was one of the last shows Slipknot did before they went and signed or went and recorded with Ross Robinson and did that debut album. It was a real crazy title shift at that point in the 90s, wasn't it? From like 1996 to 1999 as far as genres go.
It absolutely was. I remember, and I'm making an assumption here. We're probably around the same age.
Yeah.
Because I remember, that mid to late, 90s, it was kind of in my orbit. There was a lot of, in terms of genre, kind of funk metal kind of stuff happening. That first Incubus record was really popular. But once the Slipknot record came out, and especially once they got that first Ozfest tour, it was just the whole dynamic changed. And it was a wild shift. And we were lucky because Sophia John, who you mentioned, she ended up moving to Omaha and became the PD out at a radio station here, and was kind of in the same building where we all played.
Right.
The building had the radio station, a bowling alley, a club, and a pool hall. It was, yeah. We don't need to get too deep into that right now, but it was definitely, knowing that she had been involved in that to a certain extent, it was like, oh wow. And we were kids, so it's like that was a big deal,
Yeah.
and I remember more often than not going to her for advice, like what can I do, what do I need to do, is this song any good, what do I need to change? And I would, even to this day, I'll always take her advice.
Oh, you and me both, man. I just saw her not even 2 weeks ago, and we were like standing in the middle of Stir Cove, and she's like, "So, are you ready to monetize this thing yet?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I want to. You got some ideas?" But you talked about that first Slipknot album. From my memory, for when the flip of the switch actually happened, was that little time period between Korn's Life is Peachy and Follow the Leader. And there's a great documentary out there. It's called Pick It Up Ska in the 90s. And it talks about the third wave of ska and how it became the biggest thing on the planet. And then 6 months later, it's like new metal absolutely but like it took it out. And I was in a ska band at the time, and that's this is the funny thing. I was in this 9-piece ska band, and like we were playing high school dances and we were playing at the college and stuff. Everybody loved us. Well, we had the opportunity to open up for Slipknot, and being cool ska guy, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna bring candy to the show, and I threw it out to the audience at the Slipknot show, like probably a month or two after the genre had died, and I think I still have battle wounds from that moment.
Some of those crowds were unforgiving. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think you're right. There was definitely a shift, and once Slipknot really kind of took off. I mean, Korn was already huge at this point. Especially after Follow the Leader came out. And then the Slipknot record broke, and then it was kind of a total, like, everybody's attention was back to these, they weren't called new metal bands at the time. And it's almost like the term or phrase new metal is more of just like a timestamp anyway.
It is. I agree.
It's like hard rock, and metal and the crossover stuff. It's just, if you had a tuned down guitar and a DJ, you were gonna be called new metal. But but yeah, it was definitely a shift, and you start to see, or started to see a lot of, labels wanting to sign those kinds of bands, and then you kind of get, it's like, okay, you're starting to get your hierarchy of bands, from that time period. Not to say that there was any diminished quality the further down you got, because at those lower levels, there's some great music,
Yeah.
you know, and going back, and another reason why Jeff and I wanted to start the podcast was we're starting to see it kind of come back around, and people are starting to, you can hear its influence in newer bands, but then you see, Slipknot is one of the biggest bands on the planet.
Yes.
Korn is still selling out arenas. You know what I mean? So
Yes.
we wanted to kind of, kind of tell our stories, and maybe turn some people onto some music that, from that time period, that they may not have either remembered or had heard of.
Not to rehash it, but, kind of going back to that era, there were a lot of, like, bands that were clearly within a metal or metal adjacent genre, but very much like, how everybody got labeled as alternative in 93, 94. It seemed like they started playing really loose with the term new metal from 1998 to 2002. Do you feel the same way? At least that's always been my perception.
Absolutely. Because you have, bands like Limp Bizkit, and then you have bands like Slipknot, and both are, considered new metal. And it's like, well, they sound nothing alike.
Right.
They may have a similar guitar tuning and the DJ thing, but that's really it.
Mhm.
So maybe, the kind of rapping vocal style, there was some overlap there, but it's like everything was just getting lumped into it. And, for, I think it was in 2000, I actually interned at Immortal Records.
Oh, wow.
And, they were the ones who released the first couple Korn albums, that first Incubus record. Um, who else did they do? I'm forgetting a big one. And yeah, it escaped. 30 Seconds to Mars was
Right.
theirs. They did some smaller bands, Switched, No One, a couple. Transmatic was another smaller new metal band. But it was, and I started to kind of see it from the inside out a little bit too. And, because they were going nuts on, these bands that were producing music with that sound, but it was getting stale,
Yes. Yeah.
unfortunately.
I've long held the theory that, and I'm right or wrong, that, everybody looks to Napster as being the death knell of the music industry, and I view it in 2 categories. 1998, and you can look this up. In the year 1998, there were more one-hit wonders than any other year in the history of popular rock music.
Really?
Yeah, and you can look it up. You look at those charts and you look and you're like, "Holy shit." There are a bunch of, so to me, what that says to me is, like, post 1996, the industry had pretty much lost its way. So they were just trying to figure out something that would stick. Cause again, I talked about the ska explosion, there was swing, there were all of these weird, like Len and all these other offbeat kind of bands and such. But then you take the new metal thing, and I know this is really long-winded, but you take the new metal thing, and it sounds like anybody that had a marketable look and could sound close got a record deal. And I think that over bloated approach to the industry probably did as much harm as Napster, but nobody's going to come out and admit it.
Exactly. And it's funny that you say that because we we talk about something very similar on We Were Loud once, and it kind of revolved around everybody having dreadlocks.
Yeah.
And if you had dreadlocks, you immediately got a record deal. You know, so everybody started putting dreads in their hair, and it was kind of funny, um, but yeah, it's they started to kind of sign those, and there was we had a conversation Jeff and I did about Crazy Town,
Hmm.
and and they had the one hit Butterfly, which was sampled from a Chili Peppers
Chili
song,
Peppers. Yeah.
and it's like I made an assumption, but I thought it was kind of funny, and I said, well, maybe they were working with a producer, they turned the record in, label says there's no hits on this, so they're going to send them back in the studio with another producer, and that's how you got Butterfly, you know. And I always thought that was the likely scenario of what happened. um who really knows? I don't, but in those kind of scenarios, like, those were the records that these labels were putting out. They were very um I hesitate to use the word derivative of kind of
Right.
the bigger bands, but they kind of were. Again, not to say that there weren't any good songs on them, because there were. But by and large, they weren't going to have a lengthy career, you know, as a band.
A really good point, and I say this with a fondness of the band and actually the album, but the Machine Head's The Burning Red compared to the rest of their discography,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah,
how that album sounded compared to the rest of their discography, and when it landed in summer of '99, and it's like, man, this sounds like nothing they've released before, but it
yeah,
sounds like a lot of the stuff that's popular right now.
absolutely. And I wore that record out.
Me too.
Even to this day, I love that record.
Yeah, me
And
too. Their cover of The Police, man, come
it's
on.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And, it's got that Ross Robinson production,
Yep.
and, and I think that, since I'm mentioning him too, that, his production style and his way of kind of extracting a performance from, a musician, it was just kind of, it defined the sound, and it
Yeah.
defined it with Korn and with Limp Bizkit and with Slipknot. Um, and and I think everybody was kind of chasing it from there on. And the Machine Head record was very reminiscent of that sound. Came a couple years later, but you got that sound. You knew what you were getting.
Yes.
It's like, oh, it's produced by Ross. I know it's going to have this sound. It's going to be Machine Head, but it's going to be this sound. That's
Right.
exactly what it was. So,
Yes, yes. So let's localize it a little bit here just for a second. How familiar were you with the Des Moines scene when Slipknot was a local band and like just on the verge of going national?
we were kind of the next class under
Right.
them. I always considered, like, if they were the senior class, we were the juniors,
Hmm.
so we weren't really traveling yet. We were just young enough to where we only knew of them.
Right.
We knew them as these crazy guys with masks on. They come through, they'll play a show, and they'll go to Lincoln, and then they'll go home. And that's all we really knew of them.
Hmm.
And they would jump on shows, so we never really knew that they were here and things like that. So we never got to really see them as a local band.
Right.
Um, but after that, we kind of partnered up with kind of the bands on our same level in from Des Moines, and that's kind of where that kind of marriage happened. And we played a ton in Des Moines, still do, and those bands play a lot here, the whole trade show kind of thing.
Right.
Um and uh, so yeah, we were just kind of right underneath it, just a little bit too young.
Right. So what I was trying to set up, and now you'll pick up what I'm putting down now, is Slipknot postmortem. Let's say you're playing a show in Omaha one night, you go play a show in Des Moines the next night. What was your immediate observation of that era at that time?
After they broke
Yeah.
Slipknot, it was there was some similarities, but it was very different. Des Moines was,
It's really hard to give the truth without sounding like you're taking a shit on Des Moines. Trust me, I
yeah,
know.
and I mean no disrespect to anybody. It was just weirder,
Yeah.
and the Slipknot aesthetic and what they said about themselves was very true. And you feel that when you go to Des Moines.
Mhm.
and play some of the places that we played, whether it was the Valair Ballroom or, Woolies or House of Bricks or wherever it was.
R.I.P. House of Bricks.
Yeah. You still got that vibe and you're like, okay, I get it now. It makes sense,
Mhm.
and that influence really, you know, it kind of set up a lot of, the Omaha bands, and everybody kind of went in that direction a little bit. But yeah, from a crowd perspective, it was different. There was there was more of an expectation in Des Moines for you to be kind of like that,
Yes.
as opposed to Omaha.
It's really weird because when I was finally ready 2 years after exposing myself to the Omaha music scene in the most negative ways possible, I went back to Des Moines and played shows, and we could get over in Omaha or in Des Moines in ways that we couldn't get over in our own hometown. And I always found that really fascinating.
We actually kind of, not to jump to current, but I get that feeling today,
Yeah.
in the band that I play with today. Des Moines is a little bit more receptive to the heavier music.
Yeah.
I think because of Slipknot, where Omaha, if you kind of think it's like, if you kind of think of, who the big bands were that came out of Omaha, you immediately go to 311, and whether they claim Omaha or LA. But that was kind of, it's like, okay, you got 311 and you got Slipknot. And it's like, okay, two completely different things. So everybody in Omaha loves 311. And if you don't sound like that, you're not gonna,
Yeah.
there might be an expectation there in terms um, of what people are gonna want. Because at the time, 311 was doing some heavier stuff.
Yes.
Um, and I think that was kind of the wave out of that kind of early 90s kind of heavier stuff. But
You're absolutely right, and that's kind of what I was hinting at earlier, where they were kind of just throwing that new metal label around and trying to lump bands that didn't fit into the new metal category on bills with new metal bands. And I remember 311 getting put on heavier bills. I remember like Incubus, even though they kind of evolved from what they were to what they became, they were still getting put on heavier bills. And even like Chili Peppers, you think about the Chili Peppers, they released Californication in summer of 1999, and you wouldn't have thought anything about Chili Peppers and Corn being on a show together, even though stylistically it didn't fucking match, man.
right, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another thing, that was so intriguing about that kind of time period, because you could go to a show and none of the bands are going to sound similar
Right.
until you got into maybe the early and mid 2000s, where it was a little bit more diluted. But yeah, you could see a Chili Peppers type band with a Slipknot type band. And like when they would do, like when the radio stations would do their big festivals, it was all those kinds of bands anyway. So it's, you never knew what you were going to get. It was just such, I don't know, it was more interesting to me, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah. 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 So, like, when you kind of consider your own trajectory, when do you feel the death knell of that era of new metal kind of really started to set in?
um Probably 2004, 2005. I remember going, I actually remember when I thought that it was gonna be done. I went to see, Lamb of God, and I wanna say Shadows Fall, maybe Hatebreed, kind of these new up and comers that were kind of doing something completely different, and kind of bringing back more of um the riff based kind of metal. And when I went and saw Lamb of God, I was just like, yeah, that's probably it, because it was so crazy. They I think they tuned maybe a half step or a full step down. It wasn't crazy like what we were doing, so it's like, okay, they tuned up, it's faster, it's more aggressive, we're toast.
Yeah.
you know and it was more intricate, it was more of the virtuoso type playing, which that's another thing, about new metal, is you didn't really have that. Like the guitar solo was dead
Yeah.
during those years, nobody was doing them. And so then you had guys in bands like that that were super shredders. It's like, oh man. And I liked it. And I was like, okay, if I like this is going to be kind of the, not to say that I'm the barometer for success by any means, but it's like these guys are probably going to do well. And
Yeah.
Lamb of God became one of the biggest metal bands, out there, you know. And some people referred to it as kind of the birth of metalcore or the new wave of American heavy metal. There's a lot of names for it. Um, but I remember that. And I think that show was probably 2003, 2004, maybe. Um, and I was like, oh no.
I think you and I are probably going to have different perspectives than, say, an average pedestrian on the subject, just being musicians and having been in bands ourselves. Because the way I kind of view it, it's very similar, is that, you had this other genre taking off at the same time. Like the pop punk emo blow up, you can't deny that there were people from both genres kind of crossing over into similar bands. And that maybe influenced it a little bit. So you have some metal guy that maybe listened to Iron Maiden and was more into the riff style stuff, but had been playing more kind of groove based. Because let's face it, new metal was more groove based stuff that was maybe like had that itch and saw somebody like a Thrice over there starting to
Yeah.
kind of play a little bit more up tempo stuff. And then MySpace, well, the MySpace explosion 2004, 2005. I think that influenced all of it all at once.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The birth of social media, because that's another thing is we didn't have that
Mm-mm.
during kind of the start of this particular genre. And it's it's wild to think back to that time. We also didn't have camera phones. And
Right.
for the majority of it, we didn't have cell phones. That's how long ago this was. That's how far we've come in the last, 25 years. So there's the only record of those times were film cameras and,
Mm-hmm.
like VHS tape camcorders and things like that. And, so it's wild to go back through a lot of those old photos and scan them and digitize them so we can put them on social media now. It's like, wow, it's like they're on one hand, I'm kind of glad that was the
Right.
case because there's no record of a lot of things, which is probably a good thing. But on the flip side, there's a lot of shows that I wish I had, video of or photos of.
Right.
Because it was easier to forget a digit or forget like a camera or your camcorder or whatever. Because you couldn't fit it in your pocket back
Right.
in those days. So a lot of that stuff, unfortunately, for me, in my experience, is gone. But for what Jeff and I did, in the record that he and I did together as Downshift, we did a full DVD with that record, so a lot of that stuff was documented during that particular time, which was really nice. It was it was a very labor intensive project to do it, but I'm glad we did it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, kind of going and building off of that, talking about the fact that there were no camera phones and digital cameras were still kind of new. Every genre hits a point where it gets overly commercialized, which leads to dilution, where the product becomes diluted. Um, do you think that at some point in time, maybe even that 2003, 2004, where new metal kind of started to become a parody of itself to some extent?
Absolutely. Um, the better new metal bands never took themselves too seriously, but you had
Right.
a lot of guys who did. And, you started to see a lot of people putting their own spin on it. Bands like El Nino and Puya and, just a wide range of folks, Crossbreed, who I still love to this day. They were kind of putting their different spin on it, which was cool. But, on the flip side, it was like, I've heard this riff before.
Hmm.
It just has a Latin beat now, or it has, cool like keyboard kind of thing over it. And so I do think that it was starting to parody itself.
Yeah.
Um, and then it just kind of woke up one day and it was gone. All
Yeah.
these bands are dropped, and it was wild too because now all of these bands I'm finding out, or I shouldn't say a lot of them, as I'm going back through their Spotify, looking for because I did like a playlist for the podcast,
Yeah.
so every time I remember a band, I'm like, oh, Pressure 4-5, oh, put them on the playlist. Um, Come to find out that they continued to release music. It just
Hmm.
wasn't being put out by a major label. And during those days, the internet was still in its infancy. MySpace was too. And, if it wasn't at the record store, you probably weren't going to hear about it,
Right.
until now. And it's like, wow, these things are popping up. Crossbreed was the same way. They released like 3 or 4 more records after their debut. I was like, didn't
It
know
would have been
that.
nice to know about this.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, that put some gas in the tank for me a little bit too, to really kind of see the podcast through. And because it's like, man, now I get to like discover these other records for the first time. And, you know, the fact that they were kind of torchbearers for the genre, through the dark time, when new metal was kind of a derogatory word. And and it still kind of is, to be honest with you, because moving into kind of from new metal to thrash metal, a lot of the thrash and death metal guys, they use it as a derogatory term. And I was like, "Ugh, I'm
Yeah.
gonna not say anything because you're bigger than me and we're adults now." But um but but yeah, um I think it definitely got a little derivative as time went on. And but that happens with every genre.
Right.
It happened with hair metal, it happened with grunge, it happened, and that's completely on the labels. When something big hits, they want 30 of them, and
And they need them
that's
quick.
yeah, yeah. And I remember too, to kind of bring it back local a little bit. Um, there were bands, out of kind of the Midwest, Des Moines, Omaha, Lincoln, that were getting signed because of Slipknot. Almost like literally, like they helped get them signed. You know, there was let's see, Dirt Fed out of
Dirt Fed.
Lincoln. Sean got them signed. Emphatic out of Omaha. They signed with Universal. Face Cage out of Des Moines. Corey
Index
started his
case.
own label to
Yep.
to do them, so it was but that was kind of towards the latter end of it.
Right.
And Emphatic was more hard rock than they were new metal, but the other two were kind of right up the middle new metal. And I loved both bands, to be honest with you.
And it's kind of crazy because you can look at somebody like an Emphatic and look at the earlier sound versus the stuff they were releasing as they got signed, and even they kind of shifted their sound just a little bit because they started off a lot heavier than how they ended up whenever they signed that date to the label.
Yeah, and you know who else is a great example of that is the band Stained.
Yeah.
If you listen to the first Stained record, it was that was really heavy. And
Yes.
then you got what's this song called Outside?
Hmm.
Um, you got that, and now we want a whole record of that. So you started to kind of see it kind of tame out, and then he just ends up doing that by himself. Um, but that's how the music industry works. And it was wild. Jared Leto, of all people, did a documentary years ago about the music business.
Hmm.
Um, and I can't for the life of me remember what it was called, but it was really good. And there was one quote, not from him, but from somebody that he interviewed. Don't recall who it was, but she was involved somehow. And she said something to the effect of, art and commerce were not meant to be married like that. And that stuck with me because it's like, yeah, 100%. It's like
Hmm.
when you're looking at art purely through a financial lens, is it really art anymore? You
Right.
know, and it's getting pretty deep, but I mean that tends to be why you get this, dilution of the talent pool, in some of these genres. And I don't know. I mean, if you had to go back and calculate a lifespan on a genre, you probably could and kind of do all these, attributes. But so again, it's really nice to see bands like Limp Bizkit and Korn and Slipknot still still selling tickets and really kind of carrying the torch.
Yeah. So I brought it up probably every single episode for like the last 15 fucking episodes. But in this modern era that we're in now, it feels like the guardrails of genre have been removed. And I think whenever people look at art, we're not as quick to, and I've used this term a couple of times the past few days, but we're not as quick to yuck another person's yum. If somebody really enjoys something, we can respect it, whether it's for us or not. I say that because there's obviously a lot of nostalgia turns that are kind of happening with our generation all at the same time. And it doesn't matter what genre it is, it's like it's all fucking coming back into the
Yeah,
forefront.
yeah.
What do you think, particularly, has galvanized the resurgence of new metal in the past couple of years? and the nostalgia for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of the newer bands who are doing it, I think that that virtuoso type of mass appeal has kind of worn thin. So people want something a little bit more simplistic and a little bit more to the point, and that's what new metal was. So I think that you're starting to see some of these younger bands, Spirit Box, Talla, bands like that, really starting to incorporate that in some of their music. Still a little bit heavier than what most new metal was doing back then, but it still has a lot of elements. But now there's new bands coming out that you're like, yeah, that's Limp Bizkit or that's whatever band. And I think that it's wild too because my stepdaughter, who's now 28, loves Limp Bizkit,
Oh, wow.
like obsessed with Limp Bizkit. And I'm like, and for when we first talked about it, I was like, really? Why? I didn't, picture you because she was, very into some really heavy stuff. And she started mentioning a couple bands that I went and listened to. And I was like, oh, now I get it. She was into bands like Kubla Khan and Bad Omens and bands, okay, it's like, okay, you've got new metal pieces in there, because I think people they really wanted to kind of go back to that simplistic. Now, factor in the nostalgia piece, we're all getting older and I'm having fun reliving parts of, my 20s. So
Yeah,
that's what's doing it for me. Um, but there was a lot of great music that I think was overlooked, um, for a variety of reasons. But it's nice to see bands incorporating a lot of that style nowadays. And, technology has changed dramatically in the last 25 years in terms of music production and, just instrumentation. Everything's digital now. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find a guitar amp on a tour, you
right.
know,
Yeah,
and, so the sound has kind of morphed, but the way songs are structured, the way riffs are written, it's all back to that groove.
mhm.
So I think that it's kind of it's coming back around, I think. And it's wild to see the next generation being like, yeah, we want to go see Limp Bizkit, you know. And and it's wild too. My family, we have a text, group text, and it's all Fred Durst stickers. We'll go days with only sending those to each other. It's wild. So
Love it. I absolutely love it. But you're absolutely you're right. My daughter will go and her playlist is all over the place. She'll have some like trap hip hop songs and like listen to two or three Stevie Nicks songs, and then she's listening to Typo Negative and The Cure. And I'm
there you
like,
go.
Liz, you are all over the fucking place, you know?
That is a diverse palette musically,
I think that's the encouraging thing that we didn't experience, because if you dove outside of your genre barriers, you were a sellout, but like now these younger kids do just look at it. Music is just music now. And so, it's kind of encouraging in a lot of ways. But
for sure. And it's interesting to see the way people digest music now because it's completely different than how we did back then. We had to go to the record store and actually buy it. Streaming wasn't the thing yet. I think, and I don't know exactly when iTunes came out, but I remember like when the iPod first came out, everybody was like floored. They were just nerding out. It's like, oh, I've got 200 songs on this thing and it's like this big. And, nowadays it's like, who cares? Like, you fit that on a thumb drive.
yeah, we got billions at our fingertips that we can play at any time for $10 a month. Yeah.
Exactly. And, and I think that plays a lot into it too, because, you can spend your $10 a month and listen to any song out there,
Mhm.
so you don't have to say, okay, I've got $10 to go buy one CD. What am I going to buy? You know what I mean? So I think now it's a little bit more acceptable to be like, and you have a lot of genre bending. You have country rap, and
Mhm.
things like that. And it's like, how did you marry those two things? But they do it very well. It's not my thing per se, but they do it very well. Um, so I think that that kind of plays into it too. But then, if you go down the kind of genre bending rabbit hole, you get back to Mr. Bungle, and I think that was probably the nucleus of what new metal was going to become anyway.
Yes, yes. So if you were to kind of dive back into your fandom, like take the musician part out of it, what's an album that came out in that era that you felt didn't get enough attention and a band that should have been much bigger than what they were?
Full Devil Jacket.
Yeah?
Full Devil Jacket, yep. And the actual debut record, they put out an EP before it. Yep, the debut was just called Full Devil Jacket. Josh Brown is probably one of my favorite singers from that time period. Um, I was lucky enough to open for them when they came through Omaha, and they have a song called Monster that when you have an entire club of people singing it, you'd be hard pressed not to cry. Like that's how moving the song is. Still heavy, still new metal kind of thing, but just an incredibly moving song. And he was such, um, I shouldn't say is, a very talented singer and front man. And, there was some struggles, with addiction and things like that. And, but they did reunite maybe 10 years ago and they did another record. Um, but yeah, that would definitely be it for me. I remember standing side stage and just watching him sing that song, and I remember it vividly. And it was just tragic to see that they never were able, for whatever reason, to get farther than they did.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that would be my pick.
Dude, great pick. Great pick. And that kind of brings me to another fun question for you. Um, there is a mythological festival that occurred in the summer of 2000 here in Omaha area. Were you one of the few bands that actually got stage time at the legendary Test Fest?
Hmm. Yeah. Or did we? Because there was two festivals that summer.
There was a rock fest, and then the Test Fest was later. And Test Fest, just for people that don't know, Test Fest was an off day of Ozfest that basically had all of the Ozfest bands except for Ozzy and Pantera.
Yep. I think, and I have my credentials over there
Do you
from those
really?
two shows. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. And just for so people that don't know, Disturbed was setting up on stage and lightning hit the fucking stage and they had to cancel it.
Yeah. I I don't think we got to play Test Fest, but we did Rockfest. But kind of a interesting, I guess the company's no longer in business, so I can tell this story now. Um, a buddy of mine who was in another band, who I won't mention his name, he was able to create fake production access passes for that production company. Still have that also over there. Um, and I bought one from him. I don't even remember what I paid for it, and it totally worked. So I don't remember if we had. I mean, we had credentials, but I don't think it got us back into catering and all that.
Right.
Um, so I had both, and so I went back there, and we had a couple of them. I don't remember who I was with, but we were back in catering when the lightning hit the stage, and I
Oh
was
shit.
actually in the bathroom. I was using the restroom when it happened, so I heard what happened, and everybody started freaking out and running. And um, that's when I had my first run in with David Draymond, um, which I don't know if Jeff and I have gone into it um, in any of the episodes yet, but we probably will. Um, we we have very strong opinions on David Draymond,
I'm
um,
sure. I'm sure.
you know. And but I remember he was talking with the girls from Kitty
Hmm.
at that point in time, and everybody was jumping over tables trying to get out because nobody knew what happened. Um, but it was definitely wild. But um, that experience was kind of wild, and that's one of the things that I'll forever be grateful for.
Yeah.
On a fake altered credential or not, I got to stand, in a group of people. It was Sonny from POD, not to name drop, but like it was such a prolific experience for me. It was like Wayne Static and Sonny from POD and the girls from Kitty. Like we were all standing outside together, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, did you get to play? Did you get to play?" And it's like for a split second, I kind of felt like I was an equal to these guys,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
like, whoa, what a crazy feeling. I mean, it was fleeting, of course, but it's like, wow. And I remember Sonny Sandoval from POD, who was the nicest guy ever. um, he asked me, he's like, he's like, what band are you in? And I told him, he's like, have you played yet? And I'm like, no, we're supposed to play in like an hour or whenever it was. And he's like, oh man, he's like, I would have come up and checked you out. I'm like, what? It's like,
Right.
does anybody else have these experiences? Because I feel like the luckiest guy on earth. You know what
Right.
I mean? Um, on a fake credential or not.
I made that same comment. I had the guys, and I don't know if it's ever going to see the light of day. I had the guys that did or are working on the Ranch Bowl documentary on my
Mm,
show. And one of the things I told them, I was like, if you were in the orbit of the Ranch Bowl and their adjacent production companies, it was like the Forrest Gump of music venues and music experiences because of all the people you would cross paths with.
yeah.
It was insane. It was absolutely insane. And it kind of goes to the point that you made at the beginning of the episode. It's just things that are probably really uncommon now were really common for us back in the day. My Test Fest story is I got to play early in the day because my band at the time sucked. But so we played really early,
With the dot.
but we played really early. And my best memory was Max Calvera of Soulfly. After the show got canceled, they basically parked their bus kind of adjacent to the exit. He got off the bus and he was handing people CDs as they were leaving the venue, like Soulfly sampler CDs. He was handing them to people himself. He has people for that. That was dope, man.
Yeah. It he was another one that I was lucky enough to open for too.
Yeah.
And I think I did it was crazy because I did like a throwback Thursday post for Narcotic Self, and I was playing in Downshift at the time, but and we had opened for Soulfly, but Narcotic opened like the show before the
Mhm.
first time Soulfly came through. So I did like a side by side, like, here's me, opening for Soulfly, and here's, the rest of the guys. But yeah, he was just an incredibly nice guy. And but yeah, it's like the stories they just come flooding back,
Yeah.
because like, as you continue to play music in whatever genre, it's like you continue to have experiences and you kind of get farther away from those. And, and I'm lucky enough and in a position that I'm grateful for where it still happens to me sometimes, you
Yeah.
know. And like for example, end of this month, we're playing with Fear Factory. And I've never
Dope.
played with Fear Factory before. And yeah, I'm forever grateful that I'm able to have these experiences
Yeah.
and open for some of these guys that were, I mean, Fear Factory was one of the pillars of new metal.
Yep.
Obsolete was,
That's what I was just gonna say. Those first two records are like elite.
yeah. And it's just like, I get like nervous thinking about it because it's like, man, I've been in music since 90 whatever, 30 years, and I've never met Dino. It's like, am I gonna nerd out? Like, am I gonna just totally fanboy out on this? Or like, am I not gonna say anything and sit in the corner and wait to play? You know?
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it's absolutely it's wild to think back to some of those. And, you know, again, I get to relive those on We Were Loud Once, and that's super fun. So
Well, talking about reliving that, and I'm sure you're very similar to me. Do you ever have moments like now, in the here and now, where you think back to some of those memories and it just feels like it was only 5 years ago, even though it was 25 years ago?
yeah. Yeah, I do. And it's, you know, it really is a scenario of you blink and it's gone. Last time I thought about it, I was 27. You know what I mean? And that was
Hmm.
20 years ago. And it's like, wow, man, like it's crazy. Time just flies. Like when you're kind of forced to become an adult for a little while, like it just life hits the gas,
Yeah.
and then you're in your 40s and you're like, whoa, what happened?
Yeah.
you know and things changed, and the ranch bowl is gone, and so it's a drag. I mean, it was a drag that place closed in the first place, but that the next generation of bands didn't get to have a lot of those experiences that we did. Now, not to say that that doesn't happen with other production companies in the area, because it definitely does, but I don't think it happens to the degree that it used
No.
to.
No.
um because I remember, how I even started to play there. I remember there was, did you ever know Roger Armstrong, the
Yeah.
sound guy?
Hmm.
So Roger, I couldn't have been more than 15, maybe 16. And, we kind of walked up there and he happened to be outside smoking a cigarette. And, we started talking to him and, oh, yeah, we're in a band. He's like, what's your band called? And we told him, and he's like, oh, you guys should play a show here. Like, really? And we were 16, 15, 16. It was terrible, terrible. We could play the whole first Corn album front to back. And that was about it. Excuse me. And he's like, listen, I'll give you a Monday. And if you do well, I'll give you a Tuesday. Do well on Tuesday, you'll get a Wednesday,
Right.
all the way down the line. And, between 97 to, 99, we had made it all the way to Saturday, and we got our first headlining Saturday show. And that was a big deal. And I just remember him kind of, I don't know. I don't remember if he winked at me or he kind of gave me a thumbs up, but I was like, yeah, okay,
Yes.
and it was definitely sad when he passed. Um, but yeah, I mean, that was kind of a wild upbringing. And, as you start to bring in more people, it's like, hey, do you want to open for these guys? Do you want to open for these guys? They're bands that I've long forgot about that we got to play with. And, I think I made a realization in real time. It was either on the show, we did an episode on Human Waste Project,
Hmm.
and had no idea that the band, well, a couple of the guys in the band went on to start a band called Professional Murder Music, who we opened up for. I was in love with Human Waste Project, had no idea that those guys started PMM. And I think, doing my research for the show, I figured out that was the case. And I was like, oh my God, I had no idea, so it's still wild to connect dots even today.
Tapping into that moment of vulnerability just for a second, do you find that doing the When We Were Loud Once podcast is its own form of therapy, aligning a more healthy relationship with nostalgia?
Wow.
Or had
Yeah.
you ever even thought of that before?
I had started to, just with, what we were doing, and kind of, thinking about what we want to talk about, what we don't want to talk about, and, on the show. And, it has brought back a lot of good memories. It's also brought back a lot of bad ones,
Yeah.
um, that I probably never dealt with the way I probably should have, you know, um, and so I'm kind of having to do that now. But I'm much older, um,
Right.
and probably in a better space mentally than I was back then, to deal with some of those things. And that was probably subconsciously intentional,
Yeah.
you know, um, because when you're going through some things, it comes out in your music, and that's kind of your therapy, and you know in your release, and it's like, well, some things are too big for that, I think, and you have to actually do the work mentally, you know
Right.
um so yeah, I do think that it's allowing me to have a healthier relationship with some of those experiences,
Right.
and then remember them, you know
Right. Yeah.
because the older you get, it's like, and they say, oh, how's it go, you you only remember the last time you remembered something, you know and I was like, whoa, that's heavy. And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of true, um so this is kind of allowing me to remember the last time I remembered these things, which was forever ago.
Yeah.
um I hadn't thought about those fake credentials in years, even though they're hanging on my wall. um but um but yeah, I definitely think it's healthy nostalgia now.
Yeah. I'm in the same place, man. Like I mean, I opened up we moved into the current house I lived in. So I've been doing my pod for 5 years, at the very end of September, 5 years. But we moved into this house in 2022, and of course when you're moving a bunch of stuff around, you just, out of morbid curiosity, you want to open up a tote, and I had every single Ranch Bowl flyer, and including Downshift and 3/4 Evil flyers from the junction that I stumbled across. And
Nice.
but it gave me pause. I mean, it was like 3 years ago that we moved in this house, and I thought about that. And there's two different types of nostalgia. There's the Uncle Rico vibe where you're just going to tell everybody you did this cool thing once, and then there's the I'm telling you this thing that I did once upon a time, and hopefully you can take something away from it
Right.
vibe.
Yeah.
Braggadocious versus lessons.
Right. Yeah. And I think, firstly, definitely send me a photo of that.
Yeah, I'll dig it
flyer,
out,
please. If I don't do it any trouble, but if you stumble across it again, yeah, I definitely think that it's, looking back, it's not to say, yeah, I did that, and I do wrestle with some of the stories that I tell. Is it am I just name dropping?
Same.
And I'm like, well, not really. I mean, sort of, but there's a point to it. I'm not doing it just, to do it. And I think that's the difference. And, I do struggle with that. And, um, you know, but ultimately, I think, um, I'm remembering these experiences again, so it's like, yeah, these are things that happened. I was lucky enough to experience these things. And, so
We don't want to broadcast it, Dan, but we're getting old, and we're having to come to terms with our own mortality a little bit.
I know. And it's, yeah, I was thinking about that too. I'm like, is this podcast going to be kind of like our memoir? Like, are we putting all this stuff out there to document it? And part of me kind of feels that way. It's like, yeah, I can put all this stuff out there. It's in the ethos now, and and that makes it real again. Because until then it was only in my head. And so that kind of gives me a little bit of a charge, and to keep doing it and to keep coming up with, because one of the things I asked Jeff early on, I'm like, how much is there to talk about about new metal? Like, are we going to fizzle out after like 20 episodes, or are we going to be able to keep it going? And we've got ideas for, I think, over 50 or 60, that we want. And it's like, man, when those floodgates opened, they opened. And so that was kind of fun.
I think you're going to find the more you do, the more your ideas will breed other ideas.
Yeah,
continuously.
I hope so, because I don't want to run out of ideas for this thing, and but it's also allowed me to kind of reconnect with Jeff, because we did this massive project together, and kind of, and I'll be honest, and he and I have only kind of closed this loop recently. The show has actually allowed us to do this. Downshift kind of, we put out that record, and and again, to kind of give folks kind of a peek into kind of what happens when a band gets signed. I hope I'm remembering this correctly. I think that I am. But so Emphatic had gotten their record deal with Universal, and they, and when that happened, the label kind of came in and kind of listened to the band and kind of figured out, it's like, okay, this person's going to work, this person's not going to work. And with Emphatic, it was the drummer that wasn't going to work.
Right.
So first person they called, to my knowledge, was our drummer.
Right.
Who
I remember that.
I had a very strong creative relationship with. We grew up writing music together, and I still need a drummer to write music. Like, I can sit down with a guitar and kind of fiddle around and write a riff, but like, if I'm going to write a song, I need a drummer or a drum machine, and so they approached him, and he came to me, and he was like, hey, I got the call, and I'm like, okay, what did they promise you? And they promised him the world, this, that, and the other thing. And I said, hey man, if I was in your position, I would do it. Right. I'm gonna be honest with you. So he did it. And we brought in another guy, and it just wasn't the same, and it kind of fizzled out, but that's kind of how it works. And I had, during that kind of process of fizzling out, I got the call from Sophia, John, actually, about Narcotic Self. And so I kind of said, okay, I clearly did not communicate it the way I should have back then, but I kind of slowly started the transition over
Right.
to narcotic from downshift. But yeah, that's kind of how it works. So, I mean, a record deal can either be the beginning or the end of your band,
For sure.
and the
For
band's
sure.
in the periphery.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, brother, I have really enjoyed this conversation. My closing question is the one that I ask every single guest. I don't care what we're talking about. And I just love everybody's different perspective. What's your advice for making the world a better place tomorrow than what it is today based off of your experiences?
Create something every day, whether it's music, it's art, it's an experience. Doesn't matter. Create something, because I'm a firm believer in um, creation is kind of the purpose of life.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, for me, it's creating music and art. For others, it could be creating an experience for a family member or whatever it is. I think oftentimes we find ourselves only consuming things, and you have to create something to kind of keep that cycle going. So yeah, that would be my advice. Definitely create something every day.
Love it. Why don't you promote the podcast to everybody that's listening or watching? Tell them where they can find it and, plug your stuff one last time, my friend.
Absolutely. No, We Were Loud Once. It's available on all streaming platforms, Spotify, YouTube, all that good stuff. We do deep dives on new metal records. As you and I have talked about, we share our experiences with a lot of these folks, and give a little bit of context too. I'm kind of, despite what I may have mentioned earlier, I'm a bit of an industry nerd, so I'm fascinated with how bands kind of come up and how they get signed, and what their stories are. So. Um, we dive deep into all that stuff, and it's definitely, if you're interested in new metal or you're just looking for something new to listen to, it's definitely worth checking out. However you digest your podcast, we're probably on the platform. So
I love this, man. I got to tell you, I this warms my heart that we spent the last hour having this fantastic conversation, but it breaks my heart at the same time that we didn't do this 25 years ago.
right, right. And we've known each other for a long time, man. And
Right.
it's crazy, and it's, again, I'm grateful for this podcast and music kind of bringing us back around, so we're
Yeah.
able to have this conversation. I'm incredibly grateful for that too. And yeah, so I definitely appreciate it, man.
The first of many collaborations between all of us, I'm very sure. Thank you so much, Dan, for doing the show. The world's a much better place with you in it, my friend.
Same to you, man. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And yeah, we'll talk soon.